You are listening to part one of Middle Class Horror with Fan Girl Jeanne. Please note that there will be other parts to this that will release throughout the summer. Happy summer scares.
Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and I am super excited to have our guest today. Please introduce yourself and tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Jeanne, also known as Fan Girl Jeanne, and I'm a media critic and all-around geek for pretty much like everything. Yeah. And I'm best known for talking about stuff on the internet, mostly Twitter.
Awesome. Well, welcome to Turn the Page podcast, where several of the librarian hosts here are huge geeks and could probably talk to you forever about this stuff. One of the things that Syosset Library is doing this summer is we are hooking into something called Summer Scares, which is it's the brainchild of Becky Spratford, who is RA for All is her handle on Twitter, and she is a librarian consultant, and she works with the Horror Writers Association. And the idea behind it is that horror is a great way to get people to read, and she and others are dismayed that it gets kind of a bad rap, and they sort of started to build it up in the summer. So Syosset Library, in this whole pandemic period, we've been doing a lot of virtual programming, found a lot of success with horror. So we decided we're just going to drive right in and have a whole summer celebrating horror. And Turn the Page is no different. So we saw that Jeanne was doing this amazing thread on Twitter about middle class horror, and immediately my first thought was we must have her on to talk about this because this is so interesting. So please discuss how you came to this and just the whole, like, all of the nuances behind it.
Well, so the thread itself, and it's actually a series of threads that's being sponsored by one of my patrons on Patreon. And it emerged out of a conversation that we were having actually about cosmic horror and about the issues that I run into a lot of times when because I'm a big horror fan. And so I consume a lot of academic information as well as fan, podcasts about horror. And a lot of it is really like American, it's very white dominated, and that perspective comes through, as I'm sure like you all are aware of, like, we definitely have a changing tides about, understanding who H.P. Lovecraft is or was. And for me, I find that like there's still a lot of exterior perspective outside of that isn't there. So like while I'm not an academic, I definitely like to re-examine how differently I experience horror movies, especially things like cosmic horror and H.P. Lovecraft. Like, I actually have a tattoo of Cthulhu, and part of the reason I have that is that I essentially embody everything that was the unknown horror that he feared. And so I actually, before I even knew about his racism, I loved Cthulhu. I loved the idea of an ancient, something that was incomprehensible to some people.
Right.
I felt like that. I felt incomprehensible to a culture that pretty much saw everything about me as being other and threatening. And so I brought kind of that perspective to looking at horror, and primarily horror cinema and the popular late 70s and 80s horror, which, when you say it, that's what people think of. They think of Michael Myers, they think of Jason, they think of Freddy. Significant figures. And what I wanted to explore with middle class horror was understanding how much of what we understand as fearful and has informed not just the 70s and 80s in horror, but all the way into right now, where it's continually being reprocessed and digested by each new generation, is, you know, a lot of it is founded in racism, ableism, classism, especially, and like kind of deconstructing the whole concept of what middle class as a cultural signifier, not a financial one, means, and how that informed pretty much like how a lot of us were just brought up thinking about what safety means, what good people look like, and how that functions, and how much it was a myth back then, and it is a myth now, obviously. So yeah, like it arose out of those conversations where I was like, this is a lot. I got to break this down into digestible pieces. So like the first thread is really just talking about what middle class was, where it emerged from post World War II, and trying to establish essentially, you know, kind of recreate. To me, it feels like it follows a similar pattern that happened in Reconstruction after the Civil War, where it's like reinstating that class of white people who are not rich but are not Black. And
Right,
you know,
right,
that
yeah.
that really came, and even part of that too was also, you're also not the poor whites either. So and so then I, you know, used the iconography of the different, you know, well-known movies, like, for example, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the whole idea of the disabled, impoverished, rural Americans as a threat to young, pretty, thin,
Right.
future of the middle class who are unwittingly going out into the vials. And it's like, which that movie on so many levels is talking about economic anxieties, because it was actually filmed in the middle of the oil crisis.
Oh, that I actually did not know.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay.
factor in the plot of the movie is that they're running low on gas. That's why they pull into the gas station where they meet the guy who turns out to be the head of the cannibal family.
Right.
Is they're running low on gas, and they don't know if they're going to make it to the next gas station, and that was a thing that right in the middle of the summer of 1973, I believe, is when I think the crisis actually started late 72. But like, yeah, so, you know, you have that part. You also have the economic anxiety of the factory. The family had been working for generations, was shut down. So there is this, you know, reoccurring theme of, you know, we all know it as like the Hillbilly Cannibals, Wrong Turn, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's you know, this anxiety that the poor will essentially consume us,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
threatening idea, and of course, it's always wrapped up in eugenics messages of like, you know, the bad kind of breeding, which usually is always the idea of incest.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that comes up in so many forms of this media.
Right. And it's really like, I just did a thread the other day because I was getting frustrated about whenever people talk about incest, it's usually, I mean, in popular culture and media, when we talk about how it is, and you know, like Game of Thrones and whatnot, it's usually never caring about the actual survivors of what is a type of abuse.
Right.
And it's always about focused on what possible disabilities the children could have, and specifically you know, either facial differences or mental illness. And so I'm like, why are we thinking that it's okay to talk about, like, you know, make jokes about people being born with disabilities as a way to criticize the parents who very likely may have been abuse survivors? Like,
Right.
why
Yeah.
is this funny, other than the fact that we think it's okay because the people that we're making fun of are rich and white and fictional? And it's like, but we're reinforcing ideas that we got very young, and associate with poor people primarily, and goes back to this idea of that when the wrong people breed, they create bad things or
Yeah.
violence, or so and so like that's an aspect of it. The idea of how the city became embodied as a urban jungle, and that the racial aspects of that cities became unsafe because they were filled with people of color and migrant people, and looking at those themes as well of like what that looks like. One of the primary examples I use in the thread was the Howling.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how like that movie especially is fascinating to look at now, to see how many of the same type of anxieties we have now of from when I believe that was 1980 when that came out. And so we have a lead who is a successful woman. She's a successful network broadcasting personality, who has been stalked by a serial killer and is being used as bait by police to lure him out. And there's this whole like opening sequence where she is, she's wired up and she's going from payphone to payphone to, get instructions from this guy. And she's in the city. And I want to say it's New York City. And it's prior to the cleanup of New York City. So it's like Scorsese's New York City,
Like
and
that part of the 80s, and when the subway trains were still heavily graffitied.
Yes. And Times Square was a place you didn't want to go. Right. And
I mean, it's still a place most people don't want to go, right? But not the same. It's not considered that the same way it was back then.
Yes, I mean, and you have like the scene where she is walking along, and she even goes into a sex shop, and that's part, and that's where she meets up with a serial killer who eventually turns out to be a werewolf. Spoilers. But what really struck me about that movie, that opening sequence, was a white woman in white in this urban space where primarily everybody around her is a person of color, and are pretty much the only people of color we meet in the entire movie, except for I think her producer, who's who's a Black man, but I don't think we see him any further in the movie. But and it really struck me how much that opening sequence reminded me of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, and about like the way the character, who is not a hero, is not supposed to be a hero, the way he talks about the people who live in that urban space, and talks about how rain is going to come and wash all this scum away, and I'm like, everything about this is a mass shooter. Like, right? And like that perspective again of seeing those spaces and the people who exist in them, many who have absolutely no ability to not live in that space, and that there are systems that keep those spaces and economically depressed, and and criminalize what people have to do to survive, and then keep that whole cycle going. But yet it's fascinating that we have been taught this narrative of that we're in danger in those spaces. Again, like I say that as a person who's watching these movies, and I watch the movies and I'm just like I wouldn't have a problem walking through that neighborhood. I grew up in neighborhoods, that are similar like that, and nothing about that's scary. But I understand the visual language being told of this, virginal white woman in danger in an urban space around male sexuality, which is a lot of what the whole movie is about. And male, by male sexuality, and again that like idea of that whole like fascinating dynamic of horror, especially as it transformed into the 80s trend of like Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street, and we get these final girls, which is a fascinating trope. I think that the final girl analysis,
there's so much. Not only has that been so done, it's like it's at the point where it's meta whenever it's actually used in a way that anybody who's aware, I mean, first of all, what was it? Scream made everybody aware of the trope, even if I don't recall if they actually used the term final girl to describe Sydney. But now at this point, it's like whenever it comes up, everybody is hyper aware of it, and it's like it almost can't not be meta.
Right. And I mean, I feel like it's like the discussions of it either way of, whether it was, a product of misogyny, which honestly it is, and whether it's feminist, I don't know, because it's a difficult argument, because I think the part of, like, I have a very, my perspective on it is that, like the arguments that it's born out of slut shaming, especially the virginal aspect is, yes and no. I think that, like, and I'm not sure, I don't think I've gotten to this yet in the thread. I think I'm actually working on this one specifically right now. But how we conceptualize women's bodies before any of this, rape originally was a property crime. And it was specifically a crime against the man, be it the father or husband of the woman who was sexually assaulted. So I think it's really important to understanding how slut shaming evolved, and victim blaming in that perspective, how that evolved came from your body being a thing that could be stolen. And if you didn't do well enough to guard against it being stolen, or if you put yourself in risky situations, like if you put your jewels out on the street corner, of course someone's going to steal them. And so I think, like, what we see in these situations, especially where the original final girls existed, it's not so much that the girls that are having sex die, it's the idea that the teens who are in situations where they're at risk are the ones that end up as victims. So absolutely, I think slut shaming and whatnot is tied into that, but so much more of that anxiety in those films is about the paternal anxiety about, where are your kids? Do you know where they are? Because especially right in the 80s and whatnot, it was, let's see, was it mutual divorce became legal, I think in 1976, or no fault divorce became legal in most of the United States by 1976. So by 80, we had a huge generation of teens who were, children of divorce. Often, the parent they lived with was working. So, like in the situation that we have in Halloween, we have a babysitter.
There's so much babysitter-centered horror that could be like a whole other.
Right, and that's an anxiety too, about, like, first off, like, how are we letting our children be out in the workforce? Because babysitter anxiety is all about working women, and it's all about women aren't prepared to, and also the anxiety of working women putting their children at risk by having children take care of their children, which is again also linked to the whole, anxiety around daycare centers and the Satan.
Yes, I actually just did an interview with an author who did a book that was based on that whole trial, which is one of many, but the whole idea that children were being abused by this supposed network of satanic people who were running daycares. It's really crazy how these things keep coming up. And when you talk about, like the middle class in general, it's that conundrum, right? It's like, okay, well, do you stay home and work, or do you give all your money to the daycare? But then, like, sometimes that's not even really a choice.
Right. Well, and I think because a lot of these anxieties are about, again, like individualizing these things of like, what choices are women making? And
right.
Not, like, why is childcare so expensive and not subsidized by employers?
Right, exactly. Because, it's like if you go if you're a working mom, you're a bad mom. If you're a stay-at-home mom, you're not a feminist, or like you're not like exercise. It's like but those choices that doesn't really happen when you're talking about dads,
right?
at all,
Right.
at all. And you're being told that women are making these choices, but it's not.
Well, it's like
Yeah.
we learned in the pandemic of this phenomenon where we do have both parents home and women are still, predominantly being burdened with both working at home and also doing childcare.
Right.
And again, I think it's exposing something that already existed again of like this deeply ingrained to the point that it's subconscious assumption that children and their welfare is directly linked to women and not men. And so what is that? And and it's all that soup of the stuff that we have in our minds, because a part of it too is the deeply ingrained cultural belief that men are just 2 inches away from becoming terrible monsters, and we've got to do everything we can to keep them in check, which is a lot of what is coagulates into how we look at villains, especially in horror. Michael Myers, we don't know. He was a child that suddenly, because his sister had sex, he murdered her. And we're never, especially in that first film, we're never really given any explanation other than he's just evil, which
Right.
is
Yeah.
one of the, at that time, especially in American culture, mental illness was still in a process of being deinstitutionalized, so it is a product of a culture that really just was like, whether you have a cognitive disability or whether you have a mental disability, just put them in a place and lock the door and never think of them again.
And from what I recall, I mean, that was possibly a retcon, even the whole idea of Laurie being Michael's sister, wasn't it? Was that originally the plan, or was it like one of those things where when they were doing Halloween 2, they might have added that part to it?
Yeah, so that is in number 2. It's right. That is when it is stated. In fact, I believe it. Yeah, I believe it's that one that it's stated that she's his sister. And in subsequent sequels, it's been de-retconned so that they're not. But now they're doing another reboot with Jamie Lee Curtis that may be a thing again.
Oh my!
It always resonated with me. Like when I saw it as a kid, I saw them back to back, and for me, it made so much sense in that weird way that in the 80s, the occults, because that was also an aspect of it, like that there was like this, he was trying to complete some ritual in which he killed all of his blood relatives and then became immortal. And I'm not sure if that's completely in number 2. This is why I only covered the first movie for my thread, because I was like, Halloween, all of these franchises are rabbit holes that nobody needs to get lost in. But I remember at the time it like made sense to me. And later re-examination as an adult, I'm like, well, of course it makes sense. It made sense to me that because the men who are closest to you in your life are statistically the most likely to hurt or kill you, and that is an anxiety that a lot of these movies, I think, really touched in, which is, I was just doing some research and I'm still trying to dig deep enough to find statistics I doubt I can find the data from the 80s, but I know right now, statistically, women are the largest audience for horror movies right now. And of course, we all know about the phenomena of true crime and how that's hugely women dominated space. And I feel like a lot of us are, we're definitely children of this era of horror movies. And I think this is also where those conversations about the final girl come from, because so much of those movies were established, like we're displaying an anxiety that women are taught and internalized from youth, of that you're always at threat, you're always being looked at, the genius chef kiss of having Halloween from the perspective of the killer, whenever we're like that feeling of someone always watching you, and not even just from a predatory sense of just feeling like every single thing you do, from the way you style your hair to the way you speak, is being observed and judged, is a feeling many women can relate to. And so that, I think, when you look at how these movies, a lot of which were made by men, although Halloween was co-written by a woman, and I think it really does show in a lot of how the girls talk and hang out. And I really felt like, oh yeah, this really reflects as you go further and see other movies where you're like, oh, teen speak became a thing because people really didn't know how women talk when they're with each other. But anyway, but I feel like it is fascinating that you see these movies that are looking from the outside and seeing women kind of as vulnerable objects that need to be, to be captured, that it still resonates with those of us on the other side of it, of knowing that, that we didn't need a movie to tell us that this was a thing. We already knew. And so it was nice to see it reflected and to get the catharsis of going through the threatening situation and having someone survive it, which I think is also a part of the appeal of true crime for a lot of women.
Yeah, I would say so for sure. I mean, I know when I speak about it with a lot of people, there's a piece of it where you're outside of it, right? Like you're reading about this horrible thing that happened to other people, but I mean, and there are unsolved crimes, like unsolved mysteries, and but in a way, for a lot of it, there's a resolution, or there's some process that leads you, or for the ones that are unsolved, people start to think about the resolution themselves. So it's almost like empowering. It's like, okay, like you saw this through, and like this is how it ended. Or in the mind of the consumer, who, as you said, were women, like they're going to figure this out and take it to their own level. And what was it, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, Michelle McNamara, yes, who unfortunately she passed, but she did so much research that she figured this out. So I feel like that sort of ignites something in a woman's mind that, well, I can figure this out, or this is how it ended, and maybe I can see an ending to other ones.
Yeah, and let me loop that back together with the whole idea of victim blaming and slut shaming that I think is a way, is a byproduct of this instinct or reaction or coping mechanism a lot of us have, where we see these situations and we go, well, I would have done this and I would have done this, and why did she do this, right? And I want to give credit to all of us, so we don't feel like we're the ones doing this to each other, because I think while it can contribute to it, I think it comes from it's a trauma response that a lot of us have that deals with the anxiety of ambiguity, of like, if I can watch this and if I can control it or come up with an outcome, then I've quieted the voices in my head that tell me to check the lock on the door 5 times, and tells me, wakes me up at 2 a.m. to wonder if that sound I heard was somebody else in the house, or, and again, it's that low thrum of anxiety a lot of us have, and we create, to some extent, a kind of magical thinking of that if I'm able to strategize and prepare for every possible outcome, then I'm okay. And again, it's all self-owning of that. It's going, so if something goes wrong, well, then I didn't plan well enough. I didn't figure this out. And I think, again, it's one of those things of that there is the cultural blame, but I also feel it is an aspect of anxiety and trauma, whether we are survivors or not. I think that especially in this culture, I don't think any women get out of feeling that trauma, whether they actually firsthand experience it or not. Because it's just, it's an oppressive weight that we all feel, and especially through media. I think that, you know, even when the stories don't intend to be you know, just normalizing sexual assault and coercion, and it still does it. And I think it does create you know, like a traumatic experience for all, or at least just an understanding of that, even if we don't cognitively grasp it, of that this will things will happen to you that you cannot control, and that's just how you have to live. And
Right.
right, and so, and a sense of like, I don't have control over anything, so therefore I'm going to try to find control over things in ways that I can. And sometimes that turns inwards and becomes different, you know, trauma responses, and even can escalate into mental illness and whatnot. So
And I'm just thinking in general of like that ending of Chainsaw Massacre, where she's, you know, like she's, all of her friends are dead, and she's obliterated all of these incestuous hillbilly people who have tortured her, and she's just covered in blood, and she's screaming, and
and she's
yeah,
almost screaming to the point that she's laughing,
yeah,
which like, oh man, I one of the things I love about that movie is how it goes to a point of forcing us to see her fear and pain, which I think often gets misinterpreted as sadistic, which I don't think that was the intent. And honestly, I don't think that's the outcome for a lot of us who watch it. Again, I think it's you know, accidental for a lot of these, but it feels like, again, it centers her in the story to a great, like, where in the beginning it's kind of like, oh, here's all the setup and here's all these, you know, teenagers doing their thing, blah, blah, blah. But then by the end, her, like, all of us are on our, you know, whether we're, you know, regardless of our gender, we're all on tenterhooks waiting for her to get away from that chainsaw. And we're, you know, hearing her screaming, and we're seeing her face, and then we're watching her get chased. And so by the end, she is embodying the experience, the catharsis that the entire audience has gone through, of like, I made it, holy crap, I made it, like, I'm
right, yeah,
I'm laughing. And I think that that type of catharsis, like that moment, I think that's what a lot of us get from horror to some extent, is like
yeah.
that safety of going through like all that intense feelings. And loop it back to camp again, of like, there are very few spaces where we're allowed to be so like open and excessive with our emotions. That I think is a big part of what's popular about horror as well, is
For
that we get to scream, we get
yeah.
to cry, we get to throw things and
Yeah,
be
it's
hysterical.
physical. It's physical, like, you know, which is why a lot of times comedy is almost considered the back mirror of it, because you
Right.
can have especially like slapstick comedy, you can have a physical reaction. You're covering your eyes because you know that something embarrassing is going to happen, but it's different with horror. Thanks so much to Fangirl Jeanne for taking the time for this episode. We will be back with more middle class horror, where we will discuss safe spaces and suburbia.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.
What I wanted to get to, I want to talk about just the idea. You talk a lot about safe spaces and the middle class and suburbia. A lot of the horror movies we think about from the 80s and 70s, I mean, like, so you have things like Jason Voorhees, Friday the 13th, which takes place in a summer camp, and like not everybody can go to summer camp. That's like a very specific economical group of people who can go to summer camp. You know, so like you were saying about the babysitter, like you're sending your children to summer camp, and then mayhem ensues, which is like the babysitter fear beyond the babysitter fear, because not only, like your kids generally are like teens themselves, but then they're in the care of teens who are going to make out and not pay attention to your kids, and it's going to be just scary. Or you have something where like Freddy Krueger, who is supposed to be a worker in a suburban school, and like all workers in suburban schools, he's just a scary, terrible person and sells his soul to nightmare demons, and mayhem ensues. But you talk a lot about that, and the car is a safe space, which is very suburban. Here we're on Long Island, Syosset, and Long Island was built by Levitt and Moses. I mean, like the whole idea of public transportation being something you don't want. You want everyone to have a car. You don't want public transportation in this area. And you have so many, not just urban legends, but also horror that deals with cars. Talk a little bit about that, because I found that fascinating.
Talking about cars as safe spaces. You covered a lot. We'll start with cars, and then I'll move into schools and summer camp. So cars, what's really interesting is around the time that we're dealing with, like when suburbs and middle class spaces were really kind of coming up, was also around the time when cars became much more readily available. And also, I think, I want to say it's like the mid 60s is when it begins to get really expansive highway system. You saw some of it in the 50s with like, exploitation films, about motorcycle gangs and racing film, like that anxiety started there. But really into when you start to get into like the 70s, you start to see a much bigger expanse of highway systems that allowed people to get from urban spaces into the suburbs within minutes. You had people of a lower income that had cars. And so then you have, and this is again something we're dealing with right now, like even just recently, where a Black man was in a suburb and was assaulted by white people who were like, why, do you live here? They didn't believe that he lived there. So you have those anxieties of, you see people who don't belong in the suburbs and the car used to be, especially in the 50s, an economic symbol of the middle class, of having enough money, not only to have one car, but maybe two, so that your wife could run errands while you were at work. And having that symbol then be somewhat degraded because, poor people of color now have it. And to some extent, some had to have it because there weren't bus systems running in the neighborhoods where they worked, as
Right, exactly. Like, you're gonna have somebody work in your house, but they're not allowed to live in your area because the deed to your house says you can't sell to a person of color. So that so and you don't have a bus to get them to work in your house. So how is that going to happen? Well,
right, then they're going to have to have cars to get to their job, or have a family that has one car that's driving everybody to where they need to go. But yeah, like there is a horror movie, but I know it's a pretty like significant one. I think it was one of Steven Spielberg's first, basically the perfect young new director film, because it's a dude in a car on the freeway being harassed by a dude in a truck, and you actually see
the Duel.
Yes.
Yeah, and but it looks like there's like a whole bunch of other like car movies that kind of came from it, but this is the one that was like you were saying was Steven Spielberg was involved with it, and that was like a Peterbilt truck trying to run a car off a road.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I remember like the reason it always sticks in my mind was that it like portions of it really you see it recreated, like I said, in Jeepers Creepers, with the big truck, which is such a fascinating like deviation, because that movie primarily is not about, it's not a road movie, not a car movie. It's mostly about like a supernatural creature hunting people for their organs. But it is that same like anxiety of being on the road away from, you know, civilization, quote unquote, which I think is a lot of those anxieties that you come with the like the car, and other movies like that, where you know, those are the earlier versions where freeways became ubiquitous and they allowed a kind of desegregation of the roads, really. And then that, you know, that creeps into the fear of like, who are you on the road with, which we see like repeated again and again. But it, you know, it is fascinating to see almost often, much like home invasion, the perspective of who's afraid, like who's vulnerable, is almost always like a middle class person in their, you know, standard middle class car. And then you see like the threats are coming from things that relate to the working class or the poor, or, you know, and
just thinking about, no, just like, you know, on that, yeah, because I know we're talking about, you know, and like we're recording out of Long Island, there's that old, you know, that old story about how Robert Moses built the highways on Long Island with the bridges at a certain height, so trucks and buses could not go under them. For a very specific reason.
And so, you know, it's fascinating to me, and I talk a little bit in my thread about like what how that type of fear mongering essentially helped reinforce things like redlining and really like you know, leaving the problems, quote unquote, of the city in the city, which, you know, the effect of that was kind of feeding into systemic oppression of the most marginalized people. But it also, I think it doesn't, the thing that struck me, especially when we were talking about, you know, suburbs and about the idea of that, like this idea that the urban spaces and people who exist in them, mostly people of color, are predatory, and that how that's kind of a misrepresentation of the actuality, which is that suburban spaces are actually predatory upon urban spaces. I thought a lot about recently reading about, I want to say it was like, it's a suburb of New York City, maybe, but I'm sure this is true of a lot of places, is that the majority of the police force doesn't live in the city. It lives in the suburbs. So you have people who don't live in a neighborhood policing a neighborhood and taking the economic benefits, which we now know police forces make a huge amount of money, and taking it out of that space to a suburban area, often maybe even a completely different town, that is essentially, you know, is essentially economically benefiting on over policing of marginalized people. And how that is absolutely true, especially if like the, you know, housing crisis. I'm in Seattle, we're going through the housing crisis, of that, you know, that a majority of the people who are making the most amount of money in the city don't necessarily live there, and they're taking their profit someplace else to a space that they can segregate, so that only, you know, and then, you know, then we can get in the whole thing about how, you know, housing is connected to educational funding and on and on and on.
And that kind of brings me, well, and really quickly, I just want to just throw out there, just because I think it's crazy. So, you know, regarding the Duel, there was stock footage from episodes of The Incredible Hulk used in that movie.
Oh!
And it was, and it was written by Richard Matheson, who, if you are a fan of the original Twilight Zone, as I am, he's all over that. But he originally published it as a short story in Playboy.
Yes, there's a lot of horror and sci-fi writers I know that have been featured in Playboy. I mean, it is funny, but it also is true that people were reading it for the articles.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know if like that's the most. I mean, it's not, but it's in my mind, like, because that's the old thing that people go back to. Now I'm just reading it for the articles, but just the fact that like people did really read it for the articles is probably like my biggest paradigm shift of the moment.
Well, right? Like, I mean, I feel like, we get those interesting disruptors from different spaces. Like, right. I would say right now, Teen Vogue is doing a lot of amazing, work that you wouldn't have associated with Teen Vogue.
Yes, you don't mess with Teen Vogue. It's like, no, like when I was a kid, like Teen Vogue was something completely different, but now it's like, oh my God, did you see what Teen Vogue published? And like a few years ago, I'm like, wait, what? What? You're talking to me about what? And then it's like, oh no, Teen Vogue is legitimate.
Yes, yeah. Amazing. They're doing amazing work. In fact, I was just reading an article today that was examining fandom and parasocial relationships, and so I'm like, and this is these are the conversations.
Teen Vogue, the words fandom being involved in Teen Vogue. I think that as a teen, I probably would have read more Teen Vogue if that was the case and gotten a lot from it.
Right? Like, oh man, I remember like my horizons opening when I discovered, the meta corner of fandoms where people were just talking about themes and things, and I'm like, oh, this is a thing. Like, we can do this, and it's not just people randomly talking individually on message boards about stuff like this. But yes, so and I think Richard Matheson also wrote I Am Legend.
I believe he did. But I know you mentioned like the car, as in like Christine is another, like that's like another horror movie where the car is a prominent villain, but there's more to it than that.
Right? Like, well, and I think again, it is all of the Duel, the car, Christine,
Killdozer.
To a whole like list of vehicle specific horror movies, but I think those, especially Christine, is a great embodiment of that idea, that very specific 1950s idea, 1950s, 1960s, of the car being a vessel of freedom, and which we know is like really specifically a masculine idea. It's a great example of how then we see movies like The Duel showing us a form of masculine anxiety through horror, of being vulnerable, being vulnerable to something that is larger, that can be physically violent and dominate you, and being out in spaces where you don't have resources to help you,
right?
And the idea that in order to have a vehicle, you have to be like, you have to have the economic independence to be a man, and to have that kind of knocked down is a terrifying idea, but it's definitely one of its time.
Okay, so Richard Matheson, he wrote I Am Legend, which was, I think, originally, was that like the Omega Man? I Am Legend.
Yes. And most people, like the newer audiences, know it from the Will Smith movie, which changed the ending, I think, for the theatrical version.
Right,
the original version of that, I find it fascinating because similar to, makes sense that he wrote for Twilight Zone, because I feel like Twilight Zone, and especially that story, has a very specific narrative that it's saying to, what could reasonably be considered his target audience of white men, of like, essentially like, we're the ones that should be dying out. Like, we're the old dinosaurs. We're the monsters. I mean, that's essentially what the story is about, is realizing we're the monsters and we need to make way.
Right.
which is
Yeah.
really fascinating. But you see that in like the Twilight Zone too. There's a lot of different segments that I feel like, I go back and rewatch them now and I go, oh, no wonder I really liked this when I was a kid, because
Yeah.
they were having, it definitely was still towards that particular audience, but it was saying some really fascinating things like I Am Legend. And relating that to a more contemporary horror movie that's based on a novel, Girl with All the Gifts, which is one of my favorite
Yeah.
movies, just straight up. I have not read the book, I will admit to that, mostly because I liked, in the movie they switch the races of the characters so that it's a little Black girl in the lead, and I liked that so much I didn't really want to go back to the book and see it in original form. But I like the movie. Somewhat spoilers.
That's okay.
Because similarly it asks the question, it changes the perspective, because so many like horror movie, like zombie movies and whatnot, or mass monster movies are about like humanity trying to struggle forth, and this one kind of points to the idea, especially in the film, when they make a young Black girl essentially the face of this new species of humans. It asks the question of like, why do we have to die, for the old world to stay? And like it makes it very, it's not subtle, but I like it because it takes that old trope of horror and kind of goes, okay, let's lay it right, let's be real blatant about the about the themes happening here, and then let's really ask the question of what world is being fought for. And I mean, if you look in a lot of like Romero's horror movies, a lot of them, the zombies, he's talking similarly about this idea of that we view a new world and change as an aggressive thing, when it's really not, and honestly isn't a new world.
And how you were talking about the Twilight Zone, I actually have a movie that I had been thinking about, The People Under the Stairs, which supposedly Jordan Peele's company is doing some sort of remake of, which I like screamed really loud and scared my husband when I heard that. But that movie, that's all good. Yeah, that movie is crazy in so many ways. And again, it's not perfect, but when I was reading your thread, I thought back to it because it embodies a lot of that. And the slumlord is like the bad guy, but there's so much more going on there.
I like to think of People Under the Stairs as being a really great example of sometimes Wes Craven. Sometimes he can be very subtle, but really I feel like part of what makes his really great stuff great is he is always at 11, and subtlety is for peasants when it comes to him. And that one, it was like there is no subtext.
No,
like I'm literally gonna make actual symbols of paternalism and white patriarchy and matriarchy be incestuous,
and they steal children, and they deface them, and then you have the whole idea of they're mistreating the poor Black people and the properties that they own, and then they have like their little girl who's dressed in white, they have to keep safe. It's just like it had all the things. I'm very curious to see what Jordan Peele does with it, because it had a lot going on there, and I don't know if it was delivered. I don't think anything is delivered perfectly, but I remember watching it and just kind of being like, huh.
I watched it for the first time recently because I had not watched it when it first came out. Mostly because like the marketing for it at the time was really weird, and I wasn't.
It really was, yeah.
Right? Then I watched it and I was like, oh, this is great. I mean, it is not subtle at all. Essentially talking about how true white affluence comes from cannibalism. It's literally that, you know, eating itself and eating its younger generation, try to force it to conform to the shape that is ludicrous and unrealistic. And also it's, you know, it's parasitic. So yeah, no, the people under the stairs, I really feel like the thing that, I mean, execution,
Yeah.
not that great.
No,
You
no,
know,
no.
but it, you know, it was earnest, and I think one of the things that was really fascinating about it was that it was explicitly talking about how those idyllic suburban spaces are parasitic upon urban spaces, and it's something that we didn't see. I'm like, I can't even think of other even more like serious movies that really address that. So, and I'm excited about Jordan Peele taking that on, because I think he has the finesse to be able to take all those themes and ideas and put them in a package where it's a little more focused,
Right.
a little less stereotypical.
Yeah.
But you know, but it's still entertaining and engaging. And man, that was a team up that I wish could have happened before Craven passed, because woof, the things that they could have made together.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I came to it later on as well, because I started watching horror later in life. I was afraid of everything as a kid, but I remember just, you know, I was watching horror movie after horror movie, and then that one came up, and I remember the marketing, and then I watched it, and I was like, huh, like, you know, like I said, you know, again, execution not perfect, but there was definitely something going on there that I don't think a lot of people at that time really understood, because if you look at some of the you know, I think it was a split between Siskel and Ebert. Like, one was like, ah, no, horrible, and the other one was like, well, there's something going on here, which embodies a lot of what, you know, of this idea that I was reading in your thread, and also, I mean, it's not a horror movie, but thinking back to something like Adventures in Babysitting, where her friend runs away and is stuck in a phone booth in the city, and she's afraid of all of these people who are, I guess, I don't know if that was supposed to be Penn Station or whatever. It comes up in themes that aren't horror too, in things that aren't horror.
Yeah, and it was like, especially the 80s, there was a lot of, I mean, that's the thing, like there was a lot of stuff in the ether that made it into those films that, you know, we don't necessarily, I don't think we remember them because we weren't processing it at the time, but when we come back to it, like, I mean, the whole what was it, what did Reagan call it, was the welfare queen?
Yes.
Like, and that whole idea of, like, again, the parasitic core of the idea that, you know, that the urban spaces were dangerous, unwelcoming, that people of color were duplicitous and untrustworthy. All of those are there. I mean, from, in, like I said, horror, comedy. I'm trying to remember. There's, I mean, a lot of that. Even like there are ones that I think do a lot of interesting work about deconstructing that. And again, like you know, turning the lens, although oh gosh, I'm trying to remember it. It's not Easy Money. It's Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy.
Trading Spaces?
Trading Places.
Trading Places. Trading
Spaces is the British home improvement show.
Oh, completely different. Yeah.
No, so Trading Places, yeah. And which was like a great, like, kind of, you know, reactionary comedy to, you know, Reagan era 80s. But again, it was much more of the extremes. It was poverty, kind of taking, you know, wealth to task, rather than going, well, what's going on in the middle ground there. But it was taking those archetypes and kind of playing off each other. But again, it was all there. And yeah, that same idea of that that our urban space is a scary, terrible place, even though it wasn't, is in a lot of media of the time. And definitely, even when it's not actually there, it's there. Like you said, like with Nightmare on Elm Street, of that your children who are supposed to be safe in their homes are even in their dreams.
Yeah, in their bed. Yeah.
That they're being threatened.
And now the conclusion of the Middle Class Horror series with Fan Girl Jeanne. In this episode, we are going to talk about masculinity in horror movies.
Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
And in that kind of like funhouse mirror that seems just so outrageous, you actually see like a level of truth. And I think part of his approach, Craven's, was to, to be outrageous so that he could say some things that were really salient. And I think he's more successful with it with like Scream. Then again, like Scream Scream basically looked at what essentially was considered the target demographic for horror movies and said, you're the killers.
Right, because and again, like, first of all, I have to just say, and this isn't just Scream, this is pretty much all of these slasher movies that are supposed to be middle class. Those houses are crazy. I don't know, like, those houses are huge. Who, like, I don't know.
That's why I say that middle class, when I talk about it, it is not about economics. It's about an ideal.
Yeah.
And because you, depending on where you live in the country, middle class could be up to $200,000 a year.
That is very true. When I watch House Hunters, sometimes I would very much like there to be an edition called House Hunters Reality Check, where the people who can get this giant house for like $100,000 or less, and they're just like, I don't like the paint in this bathroom, I don't want this house, come to Long Island and be like, so do you want to know what you can get for that here?
Right. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It is. I mean, that again is like a reflection of systems that are in place that are causing these problems.
Right.
And I think I think it is an interesting subtext, whether it's on purpose or not, of a lot of those movies. That even Halloween, that was being shot in a suburb of California. It was supposed to be, I think, somewhere on the East Coast is where it's supposed to be set, but it is a pretty affluent neighborhood.
Yeah, and Sydney's house is huge. It's huge. It is. But a few things about that movie. First of all, yeah, the guys who are, again, spoiler alert, it's been over 20 years. You should be okay with this. The bad guys are like these obnoxious twerps who are obsessed with all of these slasher movies and terrorizing women because they're like, oh, well, you're not a virgin anymore. It says you gotta die. Ha ha. Like, come on. Like, what is it? That whole meme, are we the baddies?
Yes.
You are.
Yes, you are. Yeah, I think that Craven, he found a somewhat of a balance, especially in Scream, of being able to be kind of outrageous while also being horrific, and being able to slide in these commentaries about like who are the real dangerous people and what this ideology. Is it Randy, the one who always lists the
I feel like
of how to survive?
I feel like it is Randy. I'm looking it up, and I know like he does not make it through the whole franchise, but Heather Matarazzo plays his sister later. Yeah.
Movie. But spoilers again. But but like even his character, like while he's supposed to be like the approachable geeky guy, insert for the audience, I still feel like there's a reflection there, because he's absolutely buying into the ideology as a rule, as if he himself couldn't possibly, you know, like that idea of, well, I'm just as likely to be a victim, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
But are you, which is one of the reasons I disliked his character being killed, even though I felt like it was just a reflection of like the writers didn't know what to do with him.
Right. Yeah.
Because I felt like, he is a great example of someone who buys into that mentality of like, if I follow the rules, then nothing's going to happen to me, as if the rules are going to ever prevent somebody from being, victim of violent crime, but systemic factors seem to reinforce that, right?
So just because I want to go in this direction, and talk about guys in horror movies. Because there's a lot of discourse about women in horror movies, and it's very obvious why. And like we talked about charisma with like Freddy, for instance, which is absolutely down to the actor who played him. I don't think that, you were saying he really brought it on. You want to talk about someone who goes to 11, like went to 11.
Robert Englund is the king of it. Yeah, well, and I mean, I would think we've seen proof of, an equally charismatic actor took over that role, and it just didn't resonate the same way. I actually, well, I don't necessarily, it's hard to say like what I like aspects of the reboot. And because I don't know if you've seen it, it made a choice to make the sexual abuse aspect
right, which is what we were talking about before, that like basically they decided in the 80s that we'll just let him be a child killer because that's cool, I guess. We're not gonna put that sexual aspect but originally he was supposed to be so they decided to put that into the reboot.
And what I disliked was they kind of did this, again, spoilers, they did like a double twist thing where the twist was the kids realizing, at first thinking, they discover that their parents killed this guy, and they're thinking that they've wrongfully killed him because they don't remember any abuse happening, and they think that they're responsible because they made stuff up. And I was like, when I watched the movie, I was like, this is amazing, then that makes Freddy a manifestation of fear-mongering of this, satanic panic. And then of course they pulled it back and, oh yes, no, he's really a terrible guy.
But really, I mean, which is a lot of those movies just about the satanic panic in general. They do a lot of those double twists where it's like, oh, but really it's not. But also Satan, hey, right? Still a thing. like any movie about witches, it's like, well, like women, the way they're looked at by society, but also witches, right? And Satan.
One of the reasons I really don't like The Witch is I'm like, you said a lot of great things, and then you shit the bed at the end. Sorry. I'm not just swear, but I did not like that ending. I didn't think it was feminist. I felt like it was like, oh, okay.
There's a lot I could talk to about that. But
let's stay back on masculinity.
Let's talk about masculinity, right? Because there is a lot of that, and in the People Under the Stairs, which I guess falls outside of your thread because your thread is mostly 70s and 80s, and that's very early 90s. But it brings it back because the family whose name is Robeson. So the Robesons, they're taking other children. They're exploiting the people who live on the properties in the urban cities. They're exploiting the Black people, the people, poor people, mostly Black people, because we get into their world through Fool's eyes, and he's one of the people who's going to be evicted because they're terrible. But he's led around the house by Alice, who is played by the same actor, AJ Langer, as Rayanne from My So-Called Life. Yes. Very little, and she's wearing this white dress, and she's running around the house with him to avoid the people under the stairs, who you later find out are these boys who were stolen by the Robesons, and they like physically maimed them. And it's interesting to me that Alice is being treated as this little fragile doll, and the boys are just being maimed. And getting to Masculinity, one of my favorite horror movies or favorite series, and possibly because as it went on it got increasingly more ridiculous, was the Evil Dead series.
Yes.
I have a very weird relationship with the character of Ash, because in general, like, if I was to ever meet somebody like him, I'd be like, just stop. But I enjoyed watching his evolution on screen. The first movie is very different. The second movie basically sums it up in like the first 10 minutes. Instead of a whole group of friends at some cabin in the woods, it's just him and his girlfriend, and then mayhem ensues. And there's some Lovecraftian stuff in there too, right? Because it's the Necronomicon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, like so talking about masculinity and horror, Ash is actually a great example of a male character allowed in a series to go from a victim to a victor, and his personality says a lot, especially as it evolves, of what we think is the kind of guy who should be a lead in a horror series and one that is a victim in a horror series.
Does he evolve, or does he like de-evolve?
Well, okay, like I would say, he got legs enough to be on land.
Yes.
Right? Like, well, I think he transformed.
He does yes.
Standard, masculine, victim in a horror movie to, essentially a masculine ideal. And okay, so interesting fact, another great YouTube channel too, Dead Meat. They do a series called Kill Count, which is just fun to watch. Like, if you don't want to rewatch an old horror movie that you love, just watch the kill count of it, and it's very funny, it's very clever. But one of the things it does an actual statistic roundup at the end of each episode, and a majority of the horror movies, at least that, so I can't say over the whole thing of the history of horror, but the majority of victims in horror movies are men.
Yeah,
not women. The memorable ones, the ones we remember, are usually women, but majority of them are men, which then begs the question, like, well, why are we all upset about violence against women since it seems to be so many men dying in these movies? And I think what's interesting is, again, where, like I talked with the car, masculine anxiety manifests in these movies about the wrong type of men.
Yes.
Yes. Or men, again, or men's sexuality or sexual appetite leading them to being vulnerable.
Beautiful. Okay, so a few things. So in the first, I'm going to sort of put the first two movies together in my mind, because a lot of Ash's original trauma cycles around the fact that his girlfriend Linda, who he gives this necklace to, and I think like in both of the movies the necklace has like this, the chain kind of is like shaped like when it's lying flat, the chain almost looks like a skull, which I thought was kind of fun, visual. But Linda dies and he's so broken over it, which is not the Ash at all that we see in Army of Darkness. Now, thinking about Ash as a final boy, because we talked about final girls, thinking about Ash as a final boy, a lot of the whole final girl thing that people talk about is that they have like these gender non-specific names, like Sydney, I think is too meta to really talk about, but like Lori, yeah, and I believe I'm just trying to go back and think in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like I think they call her Stretch. It's something, yeah, it's not like, but to that point, a lot of people who have then taken the book that was written, Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol J. Clover, they'll build upon it and they'll be like, okay, I'm going to have a final girl in this movie and her name is going to be Lauren, because Lauren was, masculine in the past, or it'll be like Quinn, like something that can be, can kind of transcend gender. But Ashley is his name, and that also fits. So he is the final boy of the people who go to the cabin. In the first movie, it's him and his friends. And then even with him and Linda, where they just make it the two of them in the beginning of the second one. And ultimately, at the end of the second movie, like, you have these people who have a strong connection to what's in the basement, which is the Necronomicon and these things that have been summoned. And he still lives beyond them. Talking about, like his evolution or his transformation, he has emotions in those first two movies. He's upset, he's sad, but Bruce Campbell is such a cartoon character in how he acts. Almost that when you get to Army of Darkness, which is not considered the best of the franchise, but it's definitely the most quotable.
Oh yeah.
He's flashing back to when he had to cut off his own arm, which I've heard argued is like a castration scene almost. And he's laughing in Army of Darkness, but if you go back and you watch that original movie, he's like screaming in agony.
Yeah, well, and okay, so a lot of people have talked about, the criticisms of, Men, Women, and Chainsaws and the idea of the final girl. So I'm not going to necessarily retread all that. What I'll say is that, like I was saying before about victim blaming and slut shaming, I think it comes out of these distorted ideas of what is safe and what's not safe and what are good choices and bad choices. Again, this idea of if I know, I'm in control, and that makes us feel safe. And masculinity within these situations and dealing with violence is exactly the same way of like, much like Randy, these are the things, but we never, those ideas of like, the things that'll get you killed in a horror movie, we don't like, we go, oh, it's a moral thing. We don't dig deeper about the ideas of beyond morality. We really think that that we take these ideas of especially like crime statistics and say, well, if you do these things, like you get drunk and you go out, you're gonna get in trouble, or if you do drugs, you're gonna get, involved in violence. Look at the statistics, except that we don't look at who is actually like disproportionately actually victims of this stuff. So like, if you only ever showed somebody popular Western horror movies from the 70s and the 80s, they will tell you that young white women are probably the most threatened demographic, the most victimized of murder. And it's not. In those eras, it was young Black men. Mm. And so again, we're distorting reality because we want it to fit this idea of that we have control and that we have an ability to be a person who's not a victim. And that definitely comes from the ideas of masculinity. Well, if you don't do this, you don't do that, then you're not going to be, if you're a strong man, if you're a tough guy, and if you do what you got to do, then you're fine. You're not going to be you're not going to be bullied. You're not going to be victimized. And you see that kind of mentality happen and take place when you look at who is victimized as far as masculine people in these movies. Who are the ones that are putting themselves at risk? I say air quotes. Obviously drugs and alcohol, but chasing women, absolutely. Right. And which I think is fascinating that we don't look at that as a form of slut shaming for men, right, at all, which is like, why are we? It's not, because what it is saying that proximity to women makes you vulnerable. And here's the really fascinating aspect of the transformation that Ash goes through from being a deeply emotionally vulnerable man who cares about a woman to a completely, like, almost cartoonishly user of women, and how that lines up with the ideals of superheroes.
Oh, yes.
who can't get close to anybody because it's for their own safety. And and that masculinity, that James Bond ideal, because that's the exact same arc that James Bond goes through, of his one great love dying, therefore he can never commit to women again.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is the idea of that emotions and true deep emotions make a man vulnerable to being hurt. Therefore it comes out in a lot of these tropes of Peter Parker breaking up with Mary Jane to protect her.
Right.
Like, anybody who gets close to me is
Doomed,
which I hate, because it it's as if soldiers and firefighters and police officers don't actually have relationships, which is false. They all do. And those stories of what it's like to be a family member of someone who risks their lives and do things, that's an interesting story, but we don't really get that because we can't comprehend a man who's in a relationship. He has a vulnerability. Again, that's a form of objectification of women and children, of that they are a thing that makes men vulnerable. And that is absolutely an aspect of how men and women, or women and children, are viewed in horror as vulnerable.
Yeah.
And causing stress. Poltergeist, great example of how women and children make a man who is a Reagan, literally reading a biography of Reagan in like the first part of the movie, makes this guy vulnerable, when in actuality, it's actually Reagan economic greed that made his whole family vulnerable.
Right.
So masculinity in horror, I think, is fascinating because you can go through and look at the victims and you can see each time what thing about those guys made them not men.
Yeah.
And be it that they are fat, be it that they are conventionally unattractive but still trying to scam on women, can't dance, right, or whatever, like those typically, and so it is, like we were talking before, it's not surprising that Freddy becomes so popular, or even Jason and Michael Myers, for their stoic, silent, unrelenting strength, become kind of ideal and become the protagonists of a series, despite the fact that they are murderers. So I think what the question when it comes to why do we find these men appealing, I talked about before, is like, look at what the heroes in our stories look like, because they look really similar to who the villains are, which isn't necessarily, I mean, there's commentary there, but I don't think we necessarily get that close. And again, about like masculinity and horror. So like a good example of how horror can raise the stakes, especially with masculine protagonists. Pitch Black is a movie I would argue is one of the best sci-fi horror movies out there. And one of the things that it does that I think gives us a really great example of the difference between feminine and masculine vulnerability is the difference between how the pilot, she exists in a constant state of anxiety from the minute the crash happens. We travel with her through the intense vulnerability through the whole movie. While Riddick's character, it seems to always be cool and in control and almost exists as a slasher murderer antagonist character for a good portion of the beginning of the film.
Carolyn Fry is the main character's name. Fry, played by Radha Mitchell.
Yes, she's awesome. Yes. So we see her, she's in a constant, unquestionable state of vulnerability, and even feeling threatened from the other people around her, knowing that, so she's not only fearing for the fact that they're crashed on an alien planet that they don't know. There's possibly monsters after them, but also she's in fear of the fact of the passengers finding out that she tried to dump them all. So she's in this constant state of anxiety and vulnerable. And then we have Riddick, who is strong, in control. Even when he's tied up, he's in control. We see him, you know, like I said, we get the voyeuristic, where we get to see through his point of view. And then they introduce the monsters. And I think you'll see this, Predator is another good example of this, where the storytelling tool of making your monsters even scarier is by making them, putting a 100% stereotypical, strong, in control man in the situation, and show that he's outgunned by your monster.
And one thing I love just in general is that Riddick is played by Vin Diesel, who voices these gentle giants of characters like Groot and the Iron Giant, which, you know, the two of those two characters, in a way, they seem kindred to each other because they are big and can be destructive, but are also protective. And he's also like, he's a huge fan of Dungeons and Dragons and all this stuff that we were told in the 80s was not cool or was evil. So finding out, you know, that about Riddick, who is this caricature and everything you were talking about, and then being like, but this is Vin Diesel, was always kind of fun to me.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, I think one of the great things about Vin Diesel being so open and out there about his, you know, geeky ness, and like even having, I believe he has a tattoo of his D&D character's name.
He does, I believe.
Is because he's not only, he's undoing that mythos that was reinforced in the 80s of the division between jocks and geeks, of this idea that these men these streams can never cross, and there's no, and which is complete BS, and we know that. So I do think that, you know, and I think he brings like an insight of that to his work. I mean, one thing I like about a lot of the stuff he does is that he's not feigning pretension. He goes into different projects based solely on like, I want to see a B movie about that. Oh look, he's not gonna pretend he's not in a B movie about witches. He's just gonna, you know, bring 150% and just be totally in it. I'm fine, you know, cars in space, yes, let's do it, you know. So I have that affection, but I think he definitely brought an aspect to Riddick that you know, in that first movie. The other ones are weird. But he brought an aspect of showing a kind of vulnerability that was allowed to be strong, but also you know, vulnerable, especially towards the end. But you know, in the first take you go through the movie, you're not sure through whether he's on their side or not, all the way up into the end. And so again, I think that is the way that a male character can survive those movies, is being a tough guy
and
as easily be a villain as the hero, and that is Ash. 100%. He is out for himself. He's going to go across everybody to get what he wants, which is fascinating. Like why is that the guy that's the hero?
Well, that's the question, because the world that he's kind of dropped into in that last movie is like, I think it's like it's almost Arthurian. I mean, I don't know if they specifically say that the king is Arthur Pendragon, but he's definitely a stand-in. And the first thing he does is like shoot Excalibur in half. And he's like, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants. So it's like you've got like this romantic vision of masculinity, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and then you've got this crazy cartoonish, like comical but ideal masculinity of that time. And well, and I feel like, you know, again, he seems outrageous, but he's not, you know, I mean, because you can see parallels
him, especially in, you know, 80s and 90s, of that guy. And especially, you know, people talk about like the rise of the geek, or the rise of the slacker types. And I definitely feel like that Ash was a precursor of that, because what he's representing is not just like, you know, the Superman, you know, fists on my hip, I'm here to save the day type of masculinity. He's representing a jaded, I don't get with this PC culture type of, again, quote unquote, type of stuff, which absolutely epitomizes the type of masculinity that really rose in the late 90s and the early aughts, where we got into Judd Apatow.
Judd Apatow, fun fact, is one of our past guests. He went to Syosset
really?
High School. Yes.
Oh, awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, and like I think he, like, because he worked on Freaks and Geeks, right?
Freaks and Geeks. Freaks and Geeks is very. There are parts of Freaks and Geeks that are directly based on people in my high school. Judd Apatow's mentor, Jack DeMasi, I took his classes. He's been a guest a few times. He's actually a really cool guy.
I think we see in his work definitely, you know, a humanizing of that experience of the geek, you know, but also like of freaks, because I think of geeks and the slacker as the two aspects of a similar type of ethos in adolescence, of, you know, either the kids that try hard or the kids that just don't want to bother. And as someone who skated between those, because being on the spectrum, I either was a genius or I was behind in special needs, quote unquote. I see that type of, you know, this is a rise of that type of masculinity that may not necessarily be strong, may not necessarily even be necessarily that intelligent or, you know, a high achieving, but is savvy. And that, I feel like Ash is savvy.
He's so savvy.
He's over it. He knows better than everybody. And like that, like you said, like if I met that dude in real life, I would be done with him in 5 minutes.
Well, I mean, like that's like the woman who's talking to him at the end of Army of Darkness, when he's like, well, you know, in a way I am king here. And she's just like, dude, just stop talking. But at the end of the movie, that's like totally it. You know, he's like bested his alternate self, okay, which is like somehow even worse than the Ash that we get. And he's like bested King Arthur and I think it was Henry the Red and Merlin. They're all just like, okay, fine, you can be the hero, dude. You know, and we'll send you back. Just make sure you say the words the right way and the incantation to send you back. But like when he's back in the real world, generally people are staring at him like, just stop and tell me where my stuff is, because he's working in S-Mart, like a, you know. But then a Deadite comes out, or a zombie for those who aren't as savvy, and he's back to being king.
And that's a fantasy right there. That is absolutely fantasy, that like I wouldn't be I'm not successful because I work at Walmart in real life. But if I was transported back to a medieval world overrun with zombies, I would be the king. And I talked about this a bit on a different podcast, talking about Guardians of the Galaxy, but I definitely feel like this idea of the savvy but kind of doesn't care slacker hero definitely emerged from that same era of like the 70s, and specifically a kind of post-Vietnam experience of masculinity. And, you know, I kind of summarize it up with like Han Solo. And, you know, I love Han Solo, but in our world, he would be Matthew McConaughey in Dazed and Confused. He would be the older dude hanging out with the high school kids. Yeah. Dating a 19-year-old. All
right. I always like, oh man. I have a lot of thoughts about Han Solo as well, but
a
I hear what
different
you're saying.
idea of
Yeah.
masculinity that exists in that. Again,
Yeah.
like I'm just, I mean, and to loop it back to Judd Apatow's work is that, again, those houses are really nice, but that
Yeah.
is still a middle class mentality of here I am in my 40s,
Mhm.
here me and my friends, and I'm not the cool guy I thought I was going to be when I was 40. And it's, of course it's not horror, but it is a kind of anxiety being manifested of why didn't I fall down a wormhole into a medieval world where I could, wow them with my yo-yo master skills.
Which is literally, by the way, the plot of the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. Right? That these geeks and like their little brother and and like I'm glad that there were some women in there, because like you talking that it was another thing about Dungeons and Dragons. Everybody but apparently Jack Chick, who wrote a tract about women playing Dungeons and Dragons and summoning demons, everybody was like, women don't play Dungeons and Dragons. So somebody who wrote truly awful things wrote something about women playing Dungeons and Dragons, and then the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon had women in it. But that was it. Like they went on a ride and they were dropped into like the world of Dungeons and Dragons where they got to be the heroes.
Yeah, well, and that fantasy, like I think that, I'm in my mid-40s, I think I can still count it as mid-40s. I'm part of that generation that grew up on things like the Goonies. Like we've had that fantasy forever of, that adventure, never-ending story. Adventure is right around the corner, and we could just any moment drop into a world where we're way more capable of handling this than adults. And then those kids became adults, and that mentality of like, I got it all figured out. And that's why I'm also not impressed by anything, and why I think we have this this idea that it's that this isn't misogynistic, because I like women and they're there and we're cool, but it's again it's not analyzing what anxieties are driving us where we are, because if you're not if men are still not feeling comfortable being vulnerable, which horror reflects that, and it's definitely still really popular, then they're not really doing the work that's going to help out women as well. And I think you look at modern horror, we look at the anxieties that a lot of people talk about. It Follows is reflecting anxieties around STIs and whatnot. And I think yes, but I think it's again about like this unknown vulnerability.
Yeah.
That and through human connection, I think there's a lot of horror and just a lot of stories in general that come down to like seem like they're about sex or about physicality, which are really about fears of connecting with other people and being vulnerable by having connections with other people, which is absolutely I think an aspect of how masculinity is represented in horror, of how often is the loner. I mean, that's another trope that's connected to that type of not traditionally physically strong, not honorable man of the people, but very much like I'm the lone Logan Wolverine,
Oh yeah, that guy. See, and I was thinking about Cabin in the Woods, which is another parody where the hero is the stoner who's not affected by everything because he's stoned 24/7, right? Like I think.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say he's necessarily a hero. I think I would say he's a final boy to some extent.
Yeah.
But even then, not necessarily, because spoilers. But
he stumbles around and he seems to make it work.
Yeah, well, and what I think, one of the, like, I both love and have issues with Cabin in the Woods, because I think it both is trying to comment on something while also replicating it, and it's really...
That's so Joss Whedon.
Right? I'm like, great that you have an opinion about people objectifying women, but you're still exactly doing that.
Right.
So I'm not really sure what we're trying to say here.
Yeah.
and for me, like the structure of like the subtext of the world happening in that, I felt like it didn't have a lot of like, it was just like, thrown together. Well, we have to do this because, and I feel like that is such a great like embodiment of how I often see how men are putting together a puzzle in the dark. Like they can feel the edges of what patriarchy is, and so they can put it together and they can see, but they can't actually see the picture that's on there. And so they may make wonderful connections about things. Like I feel like James Cameron's Terminator movies, and specifically 1, 2, and then Dark Fate, are an amazing like thesis on womanhood and motherhood, and about how like, because I'm sorry, John Connor fans, but he is not the lead of that show. No. He is the MacGuffin. Yeah. And
literally, he really is.
He literally is the MacGuffin. Absolutely. And really the leader of that saves humanity is Sarah Connor. Yeah. Because he wouldn't be who he was if he had been trained by her. And that's right. One of the things I think that was beautiful that came out of Dark Fate was like, yes, if we could have done that a little bit better, that is a perfect, ending of her arc as a character. But again, like, I feel like I don't think that was the intention. I think it just resulted from like, well, let's do this differently and let's do this differently. And so I feel like, Cabin in the Woods, and I think, like we talked about with victim blaming and slut shaming, is that we have these pieces that seem to make sense to us as we put them together, or as men put them together, but they're not seeing all the aspects of the pieces. They're only just seeing the outlines of it. Right. And so it may resonate with women. Men exist in the same world we do, and they see. Yeah. And so I do feel like I want to give credit for that, like especially Wes Craven towards the end of his life, he really was reflective about how, like, he even said the words "so many dead girls." Like he was very aware of the impact his work had, and I feel like Scream was really him trying to kind of counteract that and to create that conversation. So like I want to say that like it is valid to feel a relationship with final girls, to feel an understanding and feel represented by the horror movies and horror tropes, while them still reinforcing really terrible things because of how we're thinking about this stuff and how we relate to vulnerability, especially because our fears are deeply connected to when we feel vulnerable, when we feel out of place. And that means we need to deconstruct what we think safety is, and whether our safety is coming at the expense of other people.
Beautifully put. So I understand you're still updating the middle class horror thread.
Yes.
We are going to put a link to your Twitter in the show notes. We're going to do it. Actually, we have done it with each installment of this episode, because this has been a multi-part episode, and it's been wonderful having you here. You've been so much fun to talk to. So I will be following along with that, but please, listeners, if any of this tickled your fancy, please check Fan Girl Jeanne out. I found this fascinating and amazing, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was wonderful.
Well, come back at some point.
Absolutely. We'll do this again.
Okay. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
Thank you for joining us for the Middle Class Horror series with Fangirl Jeanne. Please check out Jeanne's original thread on Twitter at Fangirl Jeanne, Jeanne. Happy summer scares, and we hope that you've enjoyed listening to this as much as we enjoyed recording it.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.